Marcus Webb had not planned to stay long. He arrived at the Grand Meridian Hotel at 6:43 in the evening, 17 minutes before the gala was scheduled to begin. He parked his own car. A gray sedan, nothing about it asked for a second look. He walked through the lobby without an assistant beside him, without the kind of entrance that makes people stop mid-conversation and whisper to each other. He moved through the crowd the way a man moves when he has spent a lifetime learning that rooms like this were never built for people like him, and has long since stopped being surprised by that fact. The Grand Meridian was one of those hotels that existed to impress. High ceilings. Crystal chandeliers that threw gold light across everything they touched. Staff in pressed uniforms who knew, without being told, which guests deserved immediate attention and which ones could be redirected quietly toward a side corridor. The ballroom had been arranged for 200 people. Round tables covered in white linen. Centerpieces taller than most living room shelves. A podium at the front with a microphone already adjusted to the height of the man who would use it. Franklin Aldridge. Marcus had heard the name long before tonight. Everyone in a certain kind of business had heard it. Franklin Aldridge had built his company from a regional property firm into one of the largest infrastructure developers on the East Coast. He was the kind of man who believed his own story completely and told it often enough that other people believed it too. And to be fair, the story was impressive. He had started with a single commercial lot in Connecticut, had turned it into a portfolio worth hundreds of millions, and had done so with the particular combination of ambition, aggression, and selective memory that produces successful men and difficult partners in equal measure. Tonight was his celebration. A billion-dollar acquisition. The kind of deal that puts a man's name in business newspapers and on the lips of people who track this sort of thing. The gala was not merely a party. It was a coronation. And Franklin Aldridge stood at the center of it, greeting guests with the comfortable confidence of a man who believed that everything he had built was entirely and permanently his to command. Marcus found his seat near the back. He had been invited by a mutual associate named George Ellison, a quiet and careful man who had worked with both of them over the years and believed, correctly, that they had something important to discuss before a certain piece of paperwork was finalized. George had arranged the seat, had sent the invitation through his office, had assumed that Franklin Aldridge's team would have been made aware that someone significant would be attending from his side. They had not been made aware. Or if they had, someone had decided the information was not worth passing upward. Marcus sat at table 14. It was the furthest table from the podium, placed near the back of the room where the sound from the speakers arrived slightly delayed and the light from the chandeliers had faded to something closer to ambient warmth than gold. There were 6 other seats at the table. 2 were occupied by a couple in their early 50s who had already decided they were bored and were doing a polished job of hiding it. 1 seat held a young man in his late 20s who was clearly someone's guest and was doing his best not to look like he had never attended something quite like this before. The remaining 3 seats were empty. A waiter came to the table. He looked at the empty seats. He looked at Marcus. He placed a bread roll near the couple at the far end, nodded at the young man, and moved on without pausing. Marcus reached for the water jug himself. He poured his own glass. He was 61 years old. He had silver at his temples and the kind of stillness in his eyes that people sometimes misread as sadness. He wore a dark suit that was clean and pressed but not the kind that announces its price tag across a room. His watch kept time without making a statement about it. His shoes were good leather, well maintained but not polished to a mirror shine. He looked, to anyone who did not bother to look carefully, like a man who had arrived somewhere he was not entirely sure he was meant to be. That was precisely the impression Marcus had spent 30 years cultivating. Not because he was dishonest, but because he had learned, early and conclusively, that the most costly thing a man in his position could do was to become visible before he was ready. He had grown up in a small town in rural Ohio where the primary lesson available to him was that the world would give him nothing he did not figure out how to earn through patience, precision, and the kind of work that never appears in anyone else's version of the story. His father had worked at a hardware store 6 days a week. His mother had cleaned office buildings 3 evenings a week after her day shift at the school cafeteria. There had been no safety net. No family friend who could make a phone call to the right person. No inheritance waiting somewhere in the future to cushion the hard years. There had been only Marcus, and a very clear understanding of what that meant. He had done quite a lot with it. He just did not talk about what he had done. The dinner began. A salad arrived at every table. Then a soup, warm and heavy with cream. The room filled with the low roar of 200 people in overlapping conversation. Wine was poured from bottles that cost more than some people's weekly groceries. Laughter moved through the room in waves, each one starting near the front where Franklin Aldridge sat and radiating outward the way laughter tends to do when one person in the room has the most power. Marcus ate without hurry. He watched the table at the front. He watched how Franklin Aldridge operated inside a room. How he touched the shoulder of every person who came to greet him, a practice gesture that communicated warmth without intimacy. How his laugh arrived one beat louder than the situation required. How he scanned the room periodically, not to check on his guests, but to confirm that his guests were oriented toward him. Marcus had done business with men like this before. Some of those relationships had produced good outcomes. Others had produced lessons of a different kind. He had not yet decided which category this one would fall into. At 7:40, something shifted. Franklin Aldridge stood from his table and said something to the man beside him. The man laughed. Aldridge looked out across the room with the slow, satisfied gaze of someone who has decided the evening is already a success and is now simply enjoying the remainder of it. His gaze landed on table 14. More specifically, it landed on Marcus. Aldridge tilted his head very slightly. The way a person does when trying to place a face and coming up empty. Then his expression shifted into something that is difficult to name precisely, somewhere between amusement and a kind of comfortable dismissal that does not even require conscious thought. He leaned toward the man beside him and said something quietly. The man glanced toward table 14. Both of them looked for a moment. Then Aldridge said something else and the man beside him laughed again. Marcus did not look away. He held Aldridge's gaze for exactly 1 second. Then he looked back at his soup. At 7:55, a woman in her mid-40s came to the table. Her name tag identified her as Claire and her role as event coordination. She bent down near Marcus with the polished manner of someone who has been asked to do something uncomfortable and has decided to do it gracefully. She said very politely that there may have been a small seating adjustment due to a last-minute change in the guest list, and she asked whether Marcus would be comfortable relocating to one of the side tables that had been set up near the entrance hall. The side tables near the entrance hall were not part of the formal dinner arrangement. They were the tables the catering staff used during their breaks. Marcus looked at her calmly. He asked whether the invitation that had been confirmed through George Ellison's office included a seat at this specific table. Claire smiled the careful smile of someone who has been given an instruction without an explanation. She said she was sure everything had been properly arranged but that given the particular configuration tonight it might simply be easier. Marcus thanked her. He told her he was quite comfortable where he was. Claire returned to whoever had sent her. Nobody came to table 14 for the next 20 minutes. The waiter who had passed Marcus without acknowledgement when delivering the bread now passed him a second time when bringing the main course. Marcus flagged down a different server, asked quietly for his meal, received an apology and a plate, and ate without making anything of it. He had navigated rooms like this his entire life. This was not new. He knew what it cost. He knew the particular arithmetic of it, what you spend when you react and what you save when you do not. He had made his calculations years ago and he had stuck to them through situations far more difficult than a missed bread roll and a waiter with instructions from someone upstairs. Then Franklin Aldridge tapped his knife against his glass. The room went quiet in the specific way that rooms go quiet when the most important person in them has decided to speak. Aldridge rose from his chair with the ease of a man standing in his own living room. He smiled out across 200 faces. The chandeliers caught the silver of his cufflinks. He looked precisely like what he believed himself to be, which was the most important person in the room, and for most purposes, on this particular evening, that was not even wrong. He said he had a few words. Those few words lasted 12 minutes. He spoke about vision. About the particular clarity required to see what a piece of land would become before it became it. About persistence, about the relationships that build slowly and the ones that accelerate. He named members of his team by name, each one receiving a small surge of applause. He named 2 investors with the practiced warmth of a man who knows that making powerful people feel visible in public costs nothing and pays enormously. He described the acquisition in language that was simultaneously specific enough to impress and vague enough to maintain the impression of a man who knows far more than he is sharing. He used the word seamless twice. He used the word historic once, toward the end, when the room was warm enough to receive it without skepticism. Then he looked toward the back. And he smiled. He said, in a voice that carried effortlessly through the room's acoustics, that he also wanted to acknowledge their mystery guest at table 14, the gentleman who had apparently found his way in this evening without quite making it onto the official list, and that perhaps next time a formal note in advance might help smooth things along. The room laughed. Not cruelly. Not with the pointed edge of people who intend harm. But fully and easily, the way a room laughs when the most powerful person in it has decided something is funny and has made it available for everyone to share. 200 people laughed. Several of them did not even know what precisely they were laughing at. They were laughing because Franklin Aldridge had laughed first, because that is how rooms like this operate, and because a joke at the expense of an unknown man at the back table carries no social cost for anyone. Except the man at the back table. Marcus sat very still. He did not look at the couple at the far end, who had gone quiet after 2 seconds and were now focused on their plates with the particular intensity of people who want to be understood as uninvolved. He did not look at the young man in the late 20s who was watching him with something close to genuine discomfort. He looked at the bread roll in front of him. He picked it up. He broke it in half. He set down his fork. Once. Slowly. Against the edge of his plate. Just once. Then he ate the bread. And he was very, very calm. Because Marcus Webb had understood for a long time that the moments when a man most wants to react are usually the moments when silence costs the least and accomplishes the most. He had learned that lesson in difficult rooms and in quiet rooms and in rooms where the cost of reacting incorrectly could not be undone. He had paid for that lesson more than once. He had stopped paying for it a long time ago. He stayed through dessert. He had his coffee. He listened to the remainder of the program. And when the evening ended, he stood from table 14, put on his coat, nodded briefly to the young man who had been watching him for most of the last hour, and walked out of the Grand Meridian at 9:52 in the evening. He did not rush. He did not look toward the front of the room on his way out. He had one phone call to make and he wanted to make it from the car. George Ellison picked up on the second ring. Marcus said 4 words. He said, "I will not sign." George was quiet. Then he asked if something had happened at the dinner. Marcus said yes. He did not elaborate. George had worked alongside Marcus for 11 years. He understood that when this man said something in 4 words it was because he had considered whether more words were necessary and decided they were not. He also understood that a decision made by Marcus Webb at 9:52 at night after an evening he had attended reluctantly was not a decision made in the heat of a passing feeling. Marcus did not make those kinds of decisions. He made the other kind. George said he understood. He said he was sorry. Marcus thanked him. He started the car. He drove home through a city that was going about its evening business without any awareness that something significant had just shifted in a quiet gray sedan on a road nobody was watching. And somewhere across the city, in a ballroom full of people who would talk about the evening for weeks, Franklin Aldridge accepted a glass of champagne from a passing waiter and told the man beside him that the deal was as good as done. He believed that in the morning he would discover what believing something completely had cost him. The morning after the gala, Franklin Aldridge woke at 6:28. His bedroom on the 24th floor of a building he owned partially had a window that covered most of one wall, and through it the city was sharp and gold in the early light, the way cities look when viewed from high enough that you cannot see any of the smaller difficulties going on at street level. He had slept well. Deeply, even. The comfortable sleep that follows an evening of sustained approval. His wife, Catherine, was already awake and downstairs. He could smell coffee from the kitchen. He could hear the low sound of a morning news program being played at a volume that suggested she was half listening to it while thinking about something else. He stretched. He checked his phone. 39 messages. That was a good number. A gala that generated 39 messages by 6:28 in the morning was a gala that had done precisely what it was designed to do. He scrolled through them without opening most. Congratulations from investors. A note from a journalist who covered the sector asking for a brief comment for a piece he was writing. Several photographs taken at the dinner and sent by people who wanted him to know they had been in the room. He looked at 2 of the photographs. He looked good in them. He always looked good in photographs. He got up. He dressed and went downstairs. Catherine asked how the evening had gone. He told her it had been exactly right. She asked if the deal was finalized. He said the paperwork was the last remaining step and that his team would have everything completed and signed within the week. He said this with the easy confidence of a man who had been right about enough things that he had essentially stopped rehearsing the alternative. Catherine nodded and poured his coffee into the cup she had already set out for him. He was at his office by 8. His assistant, Oliver, a young man of 28 who had been with him for 3 years and had learned to read the temperature of the office before the day officially began, had already arranged the morning. 3 calls scheduled. The acquisition file on the desk flagged at the sections that required his attention. A draft of the press release that his communications team wanted to send once the final documents were signed. A note about 2 follow-up meetings with partner firms that could wait until next week. Everything arranged. Everything in its correct order. Franklin sat down, picked up the acquisition file, and began reading through the executive summary his legal team had prepared. At 8:43, Oliver knocked. He said that David Lawson from the legal team was outside and asking for a few minutes. Franklin told him to send David in. David Lawson was 43, had been with the company for 9 years, and had the manner of a man who had spent most of those 9 years in rooms where the news he was delivering mattered a great deal to people who did not always want to hear it. He had developed, as a result, a particular way of entering those rooms and saying what he needed to say without preamble, because he had found that preamble made people more anxious, not less. He came in, closed the door behind him, and sat down across from Franklin without being invited, which was something he only did when the reason for sitting down outweighed the usual protocols. Franklin looked at him. David said there was a problem with the land parcel. Franklin asked which one. David said the Alcott parcel. Franklin set down the executive summary. The Alcott parcel was 340 acres of land that sat at the geographic center of the entire acquisition. It was not the largest single piece of land involved in the deal. There were larger parcels on either side of it. But it was the most necessary piece. It occupied the exact position in the infrastructure corridor that made every other piece of the deal function. Without it, the corridor could not be completed as designed. Without the corridor, you had 2 separately valuable stretches of land connected by nothing, which is a different thing entirely from a unified infrastructure project worth $1 billion. 3 signatures had been required for the Alcott parcel. 2 had been obtained months ago, without complication. A regional land trust whose board had approved the sale at their regular meeting. a private family estate whose executor had signed within a week of being approached. The third signature belonged to a holding company registered in Delaware. A quiet firm. Small on paper. The kind of entity that appears in land records and nowhere else. David said the holding company had withdrawn from the agreement. Franklin asked him to repeat that. David said it again, the same words in the same order, because that was what the situation required. Franklin asked what withdrawn meant in this context. David said it meant that the holding company's attorney had contacted their office that morning at 8:01 and communicated, with complete legal precision, that his client was no longer proceeding with the land rights agreement. He said the letter had cited the existing contract language, which gave either party the right to withdraw before full execution under specific conditions. Those conditions, apparently, had been met. Franklin stared at him across the desk. He said that was not possible. David said he understood that, but that the letter existed and that their own legal team had confirmed the contract language was being cited correctly. Franklin asked why. He asked what reason had been given. David said no reason had been given. No explanation. No request for renegotiation. No indication of a specific concern that could be addressed. Simply a notification of withdrawal, delivered at 8:01 on a Thursday morning by an attorney named Charles Dowd, whose small office occupied the third floor of a building that did not announce itself. Franklin pushed back his chair. He stood up. He walked to the window the way he always walked to the window when something required him to think while appearing to be composed. The city was doing what the city does at this hour. Moving. Functioning. Being completely indifferent to the particular problem that had just arrived on his desk. He asked David whether this was a negotiating strategy. Whether someone on the other side was pushing for a better price at the final moment, which was not an uncommon thing in deals of this size and was something he had navigated before. He had navigated it more than once. He knew how to handle that kind of pressure. David said he did not believe it was a negotiating strategy. Franklin asked what made him say that. David said because the communication did not read like a negotiating position. It did not contain any language that invited a response. It did not name a figure or a revised term or a condition under which the withdrawal might be reconsidered. It read like the communication of a man who had made a decision and was not interested in discussing it. Franklin turned from the window. He asked who owned the holding company. David placed a folder on the desk. Franklin sat back down and opened it. Inside was a name. He read it. He did not recognize it. He read it a second time. He said the name aloud, quietly, the way you say a word when you're trying to find where it belongs and what you already know. It did not land anywhere familiar. He told David to find everything available on this person. Legal history. Business associations. Any public records, any deals they had been involved in, any professional profile at all. He said he wanted it on his desk by early afternoon. David said he had already begun that process that morning before coming upstairs. Franklin said good. He asked how long. David said by 2. Franklin nodded. He told David he would also need a complete log of any communications that had come into the office from this holding company or from anyone acting on their behalf over the past several months. David made a note. He left. Franklin sat alone in his office for the next hour and a half. Oliver brought in the calls that had been scheduled. Franklin took 2 of them, managed them professionally, said nothing about the morning's development to either party. The third call he pushed to the afternoon. He spent the time between calls reading the acquisition file in a different way than he had read it that morning, looking for the Alcott parcel in every place it appeared, trying to understand precisely how dependent the entire structure was on that specific piece of land. The answer, by the time he finished, was very dependent. He called Patricia Holt, his senior project director, into the office at 10:30 and asked her to evaluate alternative corridor routes that did not require the Alcott parcel. Patricia was 52, precise, and had been in infrastructure development for 25 years. She looked at the maps. She looked at the surrounding land ownership data. She looked at Franklin. She said she would run the analysis but that she wanted to be transparent with him about her initial read, which was that the Alcott parcel had been selected for the corridor because it was the only viable geographic option within the project's existing parameters. Franklin said run the analysis anyway. Patricia said she would have something by morning. At 2 in the afternoon, David Lawson returned. He had a thicker folder this time. He set it on the desk with the particular careful quality of someone placing something breakable on a surface, which Franklin noticed because David was not normally the kind of person whose movements communicated anything beyond efficiency. Franklin opened it. He read for 14 minutes. Marcus Webb was 61 years old. He had been born in a small town in Ohio to a family with no business connections and no financial cushion. He had attended a public university on a partial academic scholarship, studied land management and finance, graduated with grades that were solid but not remarkable, and had then spent the better part of 15 years in positions that were, on their surface, entirely unremarkable. Regional land assessor for a county office in the Midwest. Junior partner at a small property firm in Cincinnati. Independent consultant for a rural development agency operating across several states in the central part of the country. None of it suggested what came next. At the age of 42, Marcus Webb had begun to acquire land. He had done it quietly. Not loudly, not in the way that attracts coverage or generates industry conversation. He had purchased parcels in places where nobody else was focused at the time. Secondary markets. Rural corridors in states where land was inexpensive and where infrastructure expansion was being quietly studied by government agencies whose planning documents circulated in limited distributions and were not generally read by people who were not paid specifically to read them. Marcus Webb had read them. He had read them carefully, and then he had acted on what they told him before anyone else thought to act on the same information. Over 19 years, through a network of small holding companies each registered separately and each appearing entirely unremarkable in isolation, he had built a position that only became visible when you looked at all of it at once and understood what you were looking at. What you were looking at was a map of the connective tissue of infrastructure development across the eastern half of the country. Not the headline projects. Not the ones with press releases and ribbon-cutting ceremonies and politicians holding oversized scissors. The quiet ones. Water treatment expansions. Energy corridor upgrades. Industrial rail access agreements. The infrastructure that is completely necessary and completely invisible until the moment someone needs it and discovers who controls it. Marcus Webb controlled more of it than anyone in a room like last night's gala had any reason to suspect. The Alcott parcel was not the only piece of land he held that was relevant to Franklin Aldridge's acquisition. It was simply the most immediately relevant one. Franklin set the folder down on the desk very carefully. He looked at the wall across from him for a moment. Then he asked David how many times Marcus Webb's team had attempted to make contact with their office before last night. David opened a smaller folder he had prepared alongside the main one. He said twice by phone, on September 9th and on October 14th. 3 times by email over the same period. Once through an intermediary named George Ellison, who had been logged in their communications system as a referred contact and had been responded to by a junior member of the administrative team who had no way of knowing what the inquiry was actually about and had therefore handled it the way they handled most unsolicited contacts from names that did not appear on the priority list, which was politely, efficiently, and without escalation. Franklin did not say anything. David continued. He said the most recent contact attempt had been on November 22nd, which was 4 weeks before the gala. Franklin did the arithmetic silently. 4 weeks before the gala. He asked David to leave the folder. David left. Franklin sat with the folder. He read through the communication log. September 9th. October 14th. November 22. 3 separate attempts, spread across nearly 3 months, from a man who controlled the one piece of land that Franklin's entire billion-dollar acquisition could not proceed without. 3 attempts that had landed in the hands of people who did not know what they were holding. He thought about last night. He thought about table 14. He thought about the man in the dark suit who had sat there quietly and eaten his dinner and done nothing when Franklin had gestured toward him with a joke he had thought was amusing. He thought about the moment, somewhere after 9:30, when he had looked toward that table and the man was gone. He had not given it a second thought at the time. He was giving it a great deal of thought now. He picked up his phone and called Oliver. He told him to get Charles Dowd on the line. It took 9 minutes to locate a direct number. Franklin made the call himself. Charles Dowd answered on the 3rd ring. He had the voice of a man who had spent 4 decades in the practice of law and had long since stopped being in a hurry about anything. Franklin introduced himself. Charles said he was familiar with the name. Franklin said he understood a communication had been sent that morning regarding the Alcott parcel and that he was calling to discuss it directly. Charles said there was not much to discuss, as his client's position had been clearly stated. Franklin said he felt confident that a direct conversation could address whatever had led to this point. Charles said there had been no misunderstanding that he was aware of. Franklin asked whether there was a financial term that had not been satisfactory. Whether a revised figure might address the concern. Charles paused. He said that his client's decision was not based on the financial terms of the agreement. Franklin asked what it was based on. Charles said he was not in a position to speak to his client's personal motivations, only to his instructions, which had been clearly communicated. Franklin said he understood, and then he said that he would like the opportunity to speak with Mr. Webb directly. He said a face-to-face conversation could resolve this quickly and to the benefit of everyone involved. Charles said he would pass the request along. He said he could not make promises about the response. Franklin said he appreciated it. He hung up. He called Harold Grant. Harold was 70 years old and had been putting money behind Franklin Aldridge's projects for 11 of those years. He was the kind of investor who had seen enough cycles of the market to have developed a settled, almost philosophical patience about most things. Almost. He said he had heard there was a complication. Franklin said it was being addressed. Harold said he was glad to hear that, and then said, with the particular gentleness that is more communicative than directness, that the investment group had structured their position around a specific timeline and that complications affecting that timeline would create conversations that none of them would particularly enjoy having. Franklin said there would be no timeline impact. He said it the way you say something when you are not completely sure it is true but need it to be true enough to get through the next 24 hours. Harold said good. They hung up. Franklin looked at the acquisition file on his desk. He looked at the executive summary with its clean language and its confident projections and its complete absence of any mention of a man named Marcus Webb. Then he looked at the folder David had left him. He thought about 30 years of building. He thought about September 9th, October 14th, November 22nd. He thought about a joke in a ballroom. He thought about 200 people laughing. He thought about a man who had said nothing, broken his bread roll in half, and gone home at 9:52. He thought about what that silence had actually been. Thursday morning came with the particular quality of mornings that matter. Not cold enough to be uncomfortable, not bright enough to be cheerful. The kind of morning that suits a serious conversation. Franklin Aldridge drove himself. He told Oliver he had an early errand. He did not put the appointment in his official calendar. He did not want his assistant's notes on this, did not want a driver who might mention where he had gone, did not want any of the apparatus of his professional life present for what was essentially a meeting he did not yet know how to describe. He had spent the days since David's folder reviewing everything his team could find on Marcus Webb, which was considerably more than he had expected to find and considerably less than he would have wished for. He had read financial analyses. He had read land registry records across 11 states. He had read the kind of dry regulatory filings that most people never look at and that, when read together with everything else, painted a picture that he found genuinely difficult to reconcile with the man who had sat at table 14 and eaten soup without complaint. He had also spent a great deal of time over the past several days thinking about something he did not particularly want to think about. He was a man who prided himself on his instincts, on reading rooms, on understanding quickly who in a given space was important, who was peripheral, who deserved his attention and who could be managed by a member of his team. He had built a career partly on the confidence of those instincts. He had looked at Marcus Webb in a room full of 200 people and made a judgment. The judgment had been wrong in every possible dimension. He parked in a small lot around the corner from the building on North Clement Street and walked to the entrance without checking his phone. The building was the kind that has existed in every city for decades without drawing attention to itself. Functional. Clean. Well-maintained without being impressive. A lobby with a security desk and a bank of elevators and a directory that listed tenants by floor. 7th floor. Webland Holdings. He rode the elevator up. The hallway was carpeted in a quiet gray-blue. Good quality, nothing that announced itself. The door at the end of the hall said Webland Holdings in letters that were small enough to be easily missed if you were walking quickly. Franklin knocked. A woman in her mid-50s opened the door. She had the calm, competent manner of someone who has been doing her job well for a long time and is no longer required to demonstrate that fact. Her name was Ruth, and she took his coat without ceremony, offered him coffee in a voice that communicated it was genuinely available rather than merely politely offered, and walked him to a meeting room with a window overlooking the street below. The room was simple. A table, 6 chairs, a window, a credenza along one wall. A white legal pad on the table and 2 pens. No company materials laid out for impression. No photographs of projects completed or awards received. Nothing on the walls except a simple framed print of a topographical map of a region Franklin could not immediately identify. He sat down. He waited. He had expected to wait longer. Marcus Webb came in at 10:06, precisely 6 minutes after the agreed time, which in Franklin's experience was actually the correct amount. Long enough to establish that this was his space and his meeting. Short enough to communicate that he was not interested in theater. He was wearing a different suit than the one at the gala. The same quality of not announcing itself, but the fabric was finer and it fit the way good clothes fit when they have been made for the person wearing them. He moved into the room and sat down without any of the preliminary social adjustments that people use to fill the first 30 seconds of a meeting where the power dynamic is uncertain. He placed a folder on the table. He looked at Franklin. He did not say it was good to finally meet him. He did not say anything about the circumstances that had brought them to this room. He simply sat with the particular stillness of a man who has no anxiety about silence and has learned to let other people fill it first. Franklin began. He said he wanted to start by acknowledging that his team had failed, on multiple occasions, to give appropriate attention to the communications that had been sent from Marcus's office, and that he took personal responsibility for that failure. Marcus listened without expression. Franklin said he also wanted to acknowledge that his own conduct at the gala on Tuesday evening had been disrespectful in a way that he was not proud of, and that he was sorry for it. He said the word sorry carefully, because it was not a word he used often in professional contexts and he was aware it could be received in different ways. He meant it simply, without strategy. He had thought about whether to say it, had decided that not saying it would be dishonest, and had said it. Marcus looked at him. He was quiet for a moment. He said he appreciated that. He said it in the specific tone of someone who has decided to accept what has been offered and to move forward rather than to stay in the territory that has just been acknowledged. Then he opened the folder. He said he had 3 options to put on the table and he would like to walk through each of them briefly. The first option was a standard land rights agreement, with the Alcott parcel released under revised financial terms that reflected the changed circumstances of the negotiation. He named a number. The number was higher than the original agreement, meaningfully so, but it was not a punishing number. It was the number of a man who understood fair value and was not willing to take less of it than the situation now justified. The second option was a structured business partnership. Marcus's holding company would enter into a formal long-term relationship with Aldridge's development group, extending beyond the Alcott parcel to include several other parcels Marcus controlled in regions where Franklin had active or planned developmental interest. He named 3 of those regions. Franklin recognized all 3 of them as places his team had discussed as potential expansion areas within the next 5 years. The third option was no agreement. Marcus said it simply. No dramatic pause. No particular weight placed on those 3 words. He said them the way you say something that is available and that you are not afraid of. Franklin looked at the folder. He looked at the man across the table. He asked which option Marcus preferred. Marcus looked at him steadily. He said the second one. Franklin asked why. Marcus said because a one-time financial transaction ends the relationship, and that was not what he had come to the gala to accomplish. He had not come to the gala to be managed by a junior assistant and redirected to a table near the catering entrance. He had come because he had been trying for 6 weeks to begin a conversation with the right person, and he had believed that a direct approach through a mutual associate would accomplish that. He said it without heat. He said it the way someone states a sequence of events that happened and that they have no particular need to dramatize. Franklin did not say anything for a moment. Then he said he understood. Marcus nodded. He said there were specific terms that the respective legal teams would need to work through, and he had a preliminary list of 3 primary points he wanted to flag before those conversations began. He named the 3 points. They were the terms of a man who wanted the deal to work and had structured his requirements accordingly. Nothing extracted from spite. Nothing designed to make the process painful. The requirements of someone who had a clear sense of what was fair and was not willing to accept less, and who had no need to ask for more. Franklin said he agreed to proceed on that basis. They shook hands. Marcus walked him to the door. Ruth brought his coat. He put it on in the hallway and pressed the elevator button. He rode down alone. He sat in the car for a while without starting it. He thought about something Marcus had said. Not the financial terms. Not the structure of the partnership. Not any of the specifics. He had been trying for 6 weeks. That was not a man pursuing revenge. That was a man who had wanted to begin something and had been turned away from the door every time he knocked, and who had then waited until the door opened on terms he had earned rather than been given. Franklin started the car. He thought about September 9th. He thought about what would have happened if one person in his office had picked up the phone and asked what the call was about and then brought that information upstairs. He thought about what that phone call would have cost. Nothing. It would have cost nothing. He thought about what the absence of that phone call had cost. He drove back to the office. He told David Lawson to begin preparing the partnership terms. He said to treat it as the single highest priority on his desk. He called Harold Grant. He told him the situation was resolved and that the deal would proceed on the original timeline. Harold said that was good news. He sounded relieved in the restrained way of a 70-year-old man who has learned to keep most of his reactions proportional. Franklin did not go into detail. He did not describe the meeting. He did not describe the folder from Tuesday, or the communication log, or the 3 dates in September and October and November when something simple could have changed everything that followed. He simply said it was resolved. He sat at his desk until 7 in the evening. He read through the acquisition file one more time. He thought about the topographical map on the wall of Marcus Webb's meeting room. He thought about what it would take to understand a piece of land the way you have to understand it to do what Marcus Webb had done. Not just geographically. Not just in terms of ownership or valuation, but in terms of what it was going to become before it became it. In terms of the plans that existed in documents that circulated in limited editions among people who were paid to read them, and the decisions that could be made from those plans if you had the patience to make them 19 years before anyone else thought to look. He thought about patience. He had always thought of himself as a patient man. He was beginning to understand that he had been confusing patience with confidence. They were not the same thing. Patience is what you have when you are willing to wait in the wrong seat at the wrong table in a room that has decided you do not belong there, and to eat your dinner quietly and say nothing and go home and make one phone call and then let the weight of what you know do its work without any help from anger or performance. Confidence is what you have when you believe the room was built for you. Franklin Aldridge had always had the second kind. He was still not sure he would ever have the first. The partnership agreement was signed 6 weeks after the meeting on North Clement Street. The closing happened in a conference room in Franklin Aldridge's building on a Tuesday afternoon, which was unremarkable except that it was the conclusion of a deal that had come within a single phone call of not closing at all. The documents were reviewed by both legal teams, initialed on the required pages, and signed in the correct places by the correct people. It took 2 hours. Afterward there was coffee and some brief conversation, and then everyone returned to their respective offices. The press release that went out the following morning announced the completion of the infrastructure acquisition and described it as a landmark transaction for the regional development sector. It named Franklin Aldridge and his company. It named the investment partners. It described the project's scope and its anticipated economic impact in language that was accurate and confident. It mentioned, in the 4th paragraph, a partnership with a landholdings firm that had been instrumental in securing the corridor rights necessary for the project's completion. It did not name the firm. It did not name Marcus Webb. Marcus had asked for that specifically. David Lawson had conveyed the request to Franklin during the final round of legal review. Franklin had agreed without argument and without asking for a reason. He did not need to ask for a reason. He understood by then what the silence was worth and why someone who had built 30 years of careful, invisible work would not want a press release to interrupt it. In the weeks that followed the signing, Franklin found himself thinking about the gala more than he expected to. Not with the comfortable nostalgia of a successful evening, the way he normally remembered his own events, but with the particular discomfort of something that had revealed information about himself that he had not specifically requested. He thought about the joke. He thought about the moment he had looked toward table 14 and decided, without a single piece of actual information, what kind of man was sitting there. He thought about how that decision had taken him less than 2 seconds. He thought about how automatic it had been, how comfortable, how completely unexamined. He thought about 200 people laughing. He thought about what it takes to sit still inside that laugh and not react. What kind of discipline that requires. What kind of practice. What kind of relationship with your own value that does not require the room to confirm it in order for it to remain stable. He had never had to develop that. Every room he had ever walked into had confirmed what he was. Or rather, what he appeared to be. He thought about those being different things. He called George Ellison on a Friday afternoon about 3 weeks after the signing. He said he wanted to have lunch. George said he would like that. They had lunch at a restaurant near George's office. It was a good restaurant without being the kind of good restaurant that makes a statement about itself. They talked about the deal. They talked about the partnership structure and the regions it covered and what George thought about the longer-term potential of the relationship. Then Franklin asked George how long he had known Marcus Webb. George said 11 years. Franklin asked what Marcus was like. George considered the question. He said Marcus was the kind of person you cannot fully describe to someone who has not spent time with him, because most of what Marcus is cannot be observed in a single meeting or a single conversation. You only understand it in accumulated time. In the way he listens. In the way he asks questions that are never the obvious questions. In the way he arrives at conclusions that turn out to be correct through a process you can never quite trace backward to its starting point. He said Marcus was one of the few people he had met who was completely comfortable with being underestimated. Franklin asked what he meant by that. George said most people, when they are underestimated, feel a pull toward correcting the impression. Toward making themselves seen more accurately. It is a natural response. It is the response Franklin himself would have had. George said it carefully and without judgment, because that is how most of us are built. We want to be seen. Marcus, George said, had made a different choice a long time ago. He had decided that being underestimated was not a problem to solve. It was a condition to use. Franklin sat with that for a moment. He asked whether the gala had been the first time someone had treated Marcus that way in a room. George said no. He said not by a long way. Franklin did not say anything else on that subject. He paid for lunch. He walked back to his car. He thought about something he had noticed at the meeting on North Clement Street, a detail he had not spoken about to anyone and had not entirely processed until now. When he had arrived in the meeting room and sat down and waited those 6 minutes, he had looked around the room the way he always looks around rooms, reading them for information about the people who occupy them. He had looked at the table and the chairs and the window and the credenza. He had looked at the walls. The only thing on the walls was the framed topographical map. He had not recognized the region immediately. Later, much later, he had looked it up. It was a region in the mid-Atlantic states where a significant utility infrastructure expansion had been quietly studied by a federal agency over several years and was now moving into an active planning phase. A region where certain land parcels, if controlled correctly, would become extremely significant within the next several years. He had looked up the land registry for that region. One of Marcus Webb's holding companies appeared in it 17 times. Franklin had stared at that number for a while. Then he had closed the browser. He thought about it now, sitting in the car outside the restaurant where he had just had lunch with George Ellison. He thought about a man who hangs a topographical map on the wall of his meeting room the way other people hang their university degrees. Not as a display. Not for the visitor. Simply because it is the territory he is thinking about and he finds it useful to see it clearly. Franklin started the car. He had a 3 o'clock call with a development team in Boston about a project that had been in preliminary stages for 8 months. He had a dinner on Friday with 2 investors who were considering a new fund structure that he had been advising on. He had a full calendar, a healthy company, and a billion-dollar deal that had closed on time and with his name on the press release. He had all of that. And he could not stop thinking about the man on the 7th floor of a building on North Clement Street who had never needed any of those things to confirm what he already knew about himself. Marcus Webb went back to his office the Tuesday afternoon after the signing and found Ruth had left a note on his desk that said congratulations in her precise handwriting, which was the closest thing to a celebration that afternoon contained. He made coffee. He sat at his desk. He opened the next file. It was the Mid-Atlantic Utility Expansion Region. 3 parcels that needed revisiting. A preliminary contact that had gone unanswered and would need a follow-up approach. A legal review that Charles Dowd had flagged as requiring about 2 weeks of attention before anything could move forward. Marcus read through it. He made 3 notes on the legal pad beside the file. Then he looked out the window. The street below was doing what streets do at 4 in the afternoon. Moving. People walking somewhere they needed to be. A delivery truck double-parked. A coffee shop with a line that extended onto the pavement because it was the right time of day for that. He thought about the gala for a moment. Not with bitterness. Not with the particular pleasure of vindication that he suspected other people expected him to feel. He thought about it the way you think about something that happened and taught you something useful and is now part of the past where it belongs. He had not wanted to make Franklin Aldridge feel the weight of what had happened. He had not been interested in punishment. He had been interested in a seat at the table. Not metaphorically. Literally. A formal, documented, contractual position in a relationship with a company that operated in spaces relevant to his work, and that would have been a natural partner for the kind of projects he was planning over the next 10 years, if anyone on their side had ever thought to pick up the phone. He had that now. He had gotten it the way he got most things. Quietly. Without announcement. By being the person who held something that someone else needed, and by using that position with enough restraint that the deal that came out of it was one both parties could live with for a long time. That was the only kind of deal worth making. He had believed that since he was 42 years old and had made his first land acquisition in a place that nobody else was looking at yet. He still believed it. He turned back to the Mid-Atlantic file. He picked up his pen. There were other parcels. Other corridors. Other rooms full of people who had not yet thought to learn his name. Marcus Webb was a patient man. He could wait. He had always been very good at waiting. And the map on his wall, the topographical map of a region that nobody was talking about yet, said everything that needed to be said about what waiting, done correctly, eventually becomes.